Hey guys, today we are watching Hitler, Oversimplified, Part 2. Been a bit since I've watched some Oversimplified. Far too long. It's overdue. And also, watching Part 2 of Hitler is overdue. So, let's just go ahead and, I guess, jump right into it.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war.
Oh
but he
yeah,
kept
we
working
just
for the
finished
army
off
as an
World War
informant.
I here.
After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole...
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm remembering things now about Hitler. I slammed my spacebar right there really loudly. So when the war ended, Hitler wanted to continue to serve in the German military. However, the German military, of course, was limited to 100,000 soldiers at the time, because of the Treaty of Versailles. Well, he managed to continue to get work for the German government. This work, however, was to essentially spy on political parties that the German government did not trust. He would get sent to go in and listen to the German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, the Nazi, what would become the Nazi Party, or is known as the Nazi Party. He at first did not agree with him. He could kind of sit in on the meetings, probably, I think, take some notes or whatnot, just, spy on him. But over time, it wore on him. He started to agree over time. It took a little bit. It took probably a few meetings before he was really starting to get involved. And then when he got involved, it wouldn't be until the later 20s when he started to have a truly leadership role in the party. And specifically, though, it was after his arrest and his time in prison. And once he was released from prison after the success of Mein Kampf, throughout Germany, did he become really the leader of the Nazi Party.
Whole bunch of red flags. So Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs. So he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive whole protection detachment.
A lot of what you'll see with a lot of far right, and then also, far left, communist parties, in a lot of countries, they will have their own kind of extremist militant group in them. And by far left, I mean the obviously dictatorial communist ideals parties. Those, right? What's weird is because of the way we identify, this is a tangent. It's totally unrelated to the video. But the way in which we define, I guess, left and right-leaning politics, communism is defined as left-leaning because of the certain, I guess, roles government is supposed to take in terms of the economy. So that gets labeled as far left. Far right, is also is on the same boat. However, when we look at it, historically, and then also kind of a lot of the ways in which they run the governments and their actions, the super far left and the far right parties kind of line up with a lot of things. They really do, and it's weird. I don't know why I'm saying this. It's just like there is they kind of have their inherent ideals are what sets them apart. However, the way they go about achieving those ideals are pretty much the same, right?
Later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi Party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time. The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, 1 US dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total...
So how... The early 1900s French were absolute morons. Like, can we agree? The French government at this time period, absolutely stupid. One, taking the war is only going to upset the people you just fought even more. Two, how do you expect them to continue to pay you back if you are taking their resources from them? Now, granted, the French were certainly using those resources as a means to, like, I guess, pay themselves back, in a sense, right? They were occupying it and forcing direct payment, in a sense, I guess. But still, God.
Approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not.
No, they did not.
Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book.
Yeah.
The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide.
He had a cozy prison stay. Yeah,
And it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany. But the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was. But a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and
as tends to sadly happen during times of strife. And I think we can compare it to, since obviously the majority of my viewership here are Americans. I think what we can extrapolate, and we can kind of see this also in the Great Depression time period. Now, when we look back with a modern viewpoint, FDR certainly does not seem like a liberal today. However, for the time period that he lived in, his policies and politics were pretty far left-leaning. Now, however, there was the way political parties worked back then and their respective viewpoints and what they wanted to get through the government and into law was pretty different than what we see today. Like, the Republican and Democratic parties of the 1930s are certainly not the parties that we have today. They are very, very different. For instance, in 1956, I believe the 1956 Eisenhower platform is something that you would not see a GOP senator, representative, or presidential candidate probably, put their platform on in the modern day. But back then, that would have been normal. But yeah, in times of strife, we get people moving to the extremes. And what we saw in America is we saw a push from the right, because President Hoover was a Republican, and a massive shift over to the left, to the Democrats. Because I think the 1920s were dominated by Republican presidents. If I'm remembering correctly, I think the 1920s were certainly dominated by the Republican presidents. So what you see in America is when, I don't know why I'm making this about America, but it's easier to compare it. And I like, when I'm learning history, I like to compare things to certain aspects of the modern day, because it helps me remember it better, and also kind of, I don't know, it's just interesting to me. But what we see in America is there's a decade of a certain party. When something goes wrong, just one thing, for instance, the Great Depression, America generally, as a whole, shifts completely to the other side and votes for the other party for at least probably another decade. We see this a lot throughout American history. We see it. Now, the one time where we did not really see it was with the fallout of Nixon, and then, oh no, what's his name? I can't remember his name. Not the president that, after Ford, Carter. There we go, Jimmy Carter. That was like one of those rare instances where we didn't really see Democrats, after the failure of Nixon, take hold for a long time. Because after Carter, we got Reagan, and then H.W. Bush. And then we got Clinton. But anyways, enough of that tension. Back to Hitler and Germany.
Want to change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh...
Like, it's sad. What makes things like this scary is that people like Hitler, people that can take power like this, we would like to think in our minds that bad guys are stupid, because it gives, I guess, us inherent comfort. However, the reality is people like Hitler most likely are fairly intelligent to a certain extent. Hitler was a master at giving speeches. He was a master at public relations, right? At least in the beginning. And in the beginning, it's just, it's very uncomforting when a bad guy, when most bad guys, obviously are fairly intelligent in certain regards. And it's just,
fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president, and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg.
The lasers.
Since he was now the leader of the biggest party, though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet." What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything.
Oh boy.
Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents.
Ooh, what a
Communists
signature.
and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to Parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions
The projector, man.
entirely on his own. With his political opponents
Cons
in prison
none.
and the SA
Yeah.
intimidating others, Hitler's law passed.
Well, also not just intimidating others. I'm sure we're going to get the... I wonder if he's going to talk about the Night of the Long Knives, or if that was the Night of the Long Knives. He murdered a lot of political opponents. Hundreds. Maybe thousands?
Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Röhm and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered. While he was at it, he took
Shit.
the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in
yep,
the
here's
past,
the Night of the Long
reporters
Knives.
who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some
Oh.
cases, even their families were murdered. In total,
Jesus
up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp. German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon,
That's
his
a good
aggressive foreign
conclusion.
policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as
Good video. Yeah. That was... This is one of... This Hitler series is one of OverSimplified's older videos. Still really, really good. And yeah, that was a really good concluding statement there at the end, kind of summarizing everything that he talked about over the course of the 2 videos into a little brief statement on Hitler's, I guess, transformation into megalomaniac and dictator jerk. I don't know what else to say. I hope you guys enjoyed the earlier tangents / rants that I went on in the video. Aside from that, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.